this conflict is going to be with us, and it's totally changing the world order. We're going to go through a time warp. You're going to see radical disorder in the next 5 years. I should explain that experience I had of learning that many of the things that surprised me because they didn't happen in my lifetime before, but they happened many times in history. The first time I was clerking on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange in 1971, and the United States, Nixon defaulted on the promise to deliver gold for money because they didn't have enough money, real money, gold, and it went down. I went on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange expecting a big down. It went up a lot. That's because I never had a devaluation. If it happened that, I found that in March 1933, the exact same thing happened with Roosevelt on the radio, same thing. So then I studied the 30s, what happened in 1938 in terms of the depression leading to the wars and so on, and the interest rates hitting zero is the exact same thing that happened in 2008. It was because I studied that we were able to make a lot of money in the 2008 financial crisis. So 3 things started to happen in my lifetime, our lifetimes, that never happened before, and I needed therefore to study them in history. The first is the amount of debt and money creation. Huge amounts of debt and money creation. Does that matter? What is the rise and decline of a reserve currency? How does that all work? I needed to see the cycles for that. The second was the amount of internal political conflict, in particular populism of the left and populism of the right. And a populist is a person who will not accept losing. They fight with their contingency, and that dysfunction and that lack of willingness to lose then had January 6th came out after the book, and there's a dynamic that we're going on for that. And the third, of course, is the great power conflict. In other words, the rise of a comparable economic and military power in the form of China rising and competing with the United States, which is also changing that world order. Those 3 things never happened in my lifetime, but are big things that are affecting things. When I went back in history, I said I needed to study how these things work. Sometimes we overlook the really big things. So I went back and I studied that, and I saw that there were 2 others that had enormous impact. The 2 others were acts of nature, in particular droughts, floods, and pandemics. And they killed more people, and they toppled more empires and changed more world orders than anything. And certainly, big issue now. And then number 5 is technological changes and how they evolve. So I needed to study those 5 forces. I saw that there's this cycle that repeats over for good cause-effect relationships. I don't believe in a cycle just because it repeats. I started to understand the cause-effect relationship.
How does everything you've learned and studied impact your thinking when one person, an authoritarian, Xi Jinping, is running China and disconnecting it from the rest of the world in terms of their ability? And then do you consider this, if they did succeed in becoming the dominant power in the world, what do you think that does for humanity?
There are a bunch of questions in there, yeah. So I'll try to remember them and take them once at a time. I think China's going to be a big power for the foreseeable future. I think the basic picture in China, the United States, the emergence of India, and so on, is the world order is going to change in a very profound way. We can't say who's going to be the winner and the loser of this game, but I think we do know that this conflict is going to be with us, and it's totally changing the world order. When you're asking, like, who's going to be the winner of this game, I'll tell you history. In the history of democracy, as Plato described in the Republic, there's a cycle. And one of the great vulnerabilities of democracies is the disorderliness, the anarchy that comes from a conflict. And so you're asking me to compare democracy and also what I'll call capitalism with authoritarianism and let's call it communism, that version of it.
Or quasi-capitalism, maybe.
But we know what we mean.
Yeah.
Okay. So when the risk of capitalism is when you have the wealth gap clash and the opportunity gap clash. And the risk, and that produces risk for democracy. So in the 30s, 4 major democracies, because of that dynamic, their parliaments chose to be autocracies. That happened in Germany, Italy, Spain, and Japan. So the risk, both have risks. I came from, and we've all been blessed with this amazing environment, that equal opportunity, the ability to be creative, rule of law, civility. But if we risk those things, in both of those, then we have a great risk. So on this war, I think it depends more on how we are with our circumstances to be strong and capable and relative to them. It certainly is going to be a test of the systems.
And it's now the largest population in the world. I guess people don't realize that they've, and they're continuing to grow, and the birth rate is in decline in China. So maybe a little bit on India and how you look at it.
And I should emphasize that every conclusion that I have is a function of measuring statistics and having them as leading indicators. And we have 10-year growth rate estimates for India, and all the countries, top 22 countries, and you can see it online if you want, country by country, and the reasons for it. India has the highest potential growth rate. I think India is where China was when I started to go in 1984. So if you look at the complexion, the per capita income, and I think Modi is a Deng Xiaoping, so that you have a massive reform, development, creativity, all those elements. There are, of course, issues, risk issues, but India is very, very important. Now, of course, there's a religious internal issue having to do with the population has 240 million Muslims, and I don't think that any of these issues is going to stop India. I also, in history, the countries that were the neutral countries did the best. So in other words, better than the winners in wars. So as we have this conflict between the United States and China and its allies, Russia, and so on, as we see that line up, countries that are in the middle, like India, are going to be net beneficiaries of that. Middle East is, again, there are 2 big epicenters where things are happening fast and quick and getting better. One of them is, let's say 3. There's the ASEAN countries. And we can say that Singapore essentially is a hub, but the ASEAN countries, which is, Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, and all of that, that's going to be a great area. The Middle East, in terms of particularly the Gulf countries, the amount of money, and they're making talent magnets. They're attracting people. You look at how the change in wealth has taken place. That's certainly it. And India.
Can you share with us your point of view on how they think about their position in the world and how you understand their intentions?
Yes, I'll give you my thoughts. I'm not making judgments. I'm just passing along. Okay. They think there are 2 different systems, 2 different approaches. They would think that an autocratic and an autocratic system, they used to have a committee that would make it, but they would say it would be very much like a company. If you had a company, you have a board, you have the executive committee, and so on and so forth, and you make sure you get the leadership. And then they would say that the world should have a competition, and that throughout history, there are these competitions in all the various ways we talk about, and there's an emergence of that, and that there's an inevitability, and I think we say that there's an inevitability for a conflict, because there's a containment, and then there's a desire to expand, and it's like almost keeping a lid on a boiling pot. That's the type of situation. I can go on at length about the particulars of their thing. They have a very good historical perspective because their history has been literally 5,000 years. Like we think of ours, they remember the particulars, and all the leaders study that. And there is a cycle that they're very conscious about. So, for example, the big risk that they believe is instability. So she says that the big storm on the horizon. He keeps referring to the big storm on the horizon. And that relates to the conflict in the world that we're talking about. But it also relates to the fact that they've got a debt problem. They have a debt restructuring problem. And their instinct through history, the learning of history, is that during such periods of time, internal conflict is a big threat. And therefore, autocracy, strong controls are the things to have. Okay, now we can explore the relative merits of that internal conflict and so on, but that's basically their perspective. Throughout history, productivity's been the greatest. And so if you take the 20s, we had the productivity, most inventions, most patents and so on in the 20s. You also had a debt problem, and you also had a wealth gap problem. I believe that in terms of the new technology, we're going to really see new technologies. Now, they can be used for weapons or they can be used for productivity, but we're going to have a reorganization of how are we going to redistribute the wealth and opportunities and so on. So if we come back, I think we just have to look at what are we fighting for now? What's going on? And I think that, of course, there's a fight over money. If you have a downturn, if you have a debt problem, and I think there's good reason to believe we will. We can get into that in a minute. But they fight over money, and they fight over differences in values. In other words, the differences in values, like how do you educate your children? What is transgender issues and education issues and those types of things. And so I think you're seeing those things to fight over. You're seeing plenty to fight over. And let's say we don't fight. Let's pray we don't fight. What we need is to come together. But if, let's say, we don't fight, you're still going to have to deal with how do you redistribute not only money, but how do you redistribute opportunities? And that's going to take figuring it out, right? And there's going to be an argument over how they do that. You're going to fight over resources. Like, we have debt, and we operate as though it doesn't matter, and we'll continue to have the pile. If you look at history, and we can get into why it is not that goes on a while. And you can't continue to increase your living standards by borrowing more than you're spending. You can't keep accumulating your debt because it has to matter. So these types of things, as they build up, as the debt builds up, as the wealth gaps builds up, and the values gaps build up, and then there's difference in reaction to controls. Some people, so you see the movement. We will have things to fight over at the same time as we hopefully will have a productivity miracle. I think that in the next 5 years, I think year by year, we're going to go through a time warp. You're going to see radical disorder in the next 5 years as each one of those things comes to pass. First with the elections as we have, then we have the conflict with the geopolitical conflict. Then we have the climate issue, which, by the way, is a very expensive issue. We should talk about how costly that issue is. And then we're going to have this issue of technology, which can provide the greatest miracle, but also is a weapon.